Good afternoon, everyone. First and foremost, thank you for joining us for today's broadcast. This promises to be a rich discussion, one where we will explore the topic of the Black family, health and wellness, a status report. I'll be joined by none other than Bill Davis, whom I will be introducing to you in just a moment. But each year, the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club provides advancement through service. Through our scholarship and educational programs, we help provide opportunities to local young people who wish to further their educational attainment beyond high school. We are the Frontiers International Club of Plainfield, and we stand for advancement through service. To donate to our scholarship fund or any of our service programs, you can do so by sending funds by Zelle to area code 732-470-4207. Otherwise, you may also send a check or a money order made payable to Frontiers International Plainfield, and you can send that to P.O. Box 428, Plainfield, New Jersey, 07061. And for your information, the organization is a tax-exempt group under the Internal Revenue Code Section 501c3 and are eligible to receive contributions that are deductible as charitable donations for federal income tax purposes. At this time, it gives me great privilege and pleasure to introduce to some and to present to others our speaker for today, Bill Davis. Bill Davis is the president and CEO of Baba's Legacy LLC, a diasporic educator and a servant leader, author, trainer, and public speaker with over 40 years of experience in education, corporate, and community settings. In the education arena, Bill has worked at Rutgers University, NYU, and other prestigious institutions, and his work has been manifested by assisting schools build inclusive environments for students and staff that foster equity and commitment to excellence. Bill partners with various organizations for diversity and inclusion training and community upliftment efforts, including clients such as Nike, Just Do It, GlaxoSmithKline, and county and state government offices. Most importantly, though, Bill is a single father of 4 incredible children who are now adults, and he is profoundly grateful to his children, also known as the crew, because they have been the wind beneath his wings. In addition to all of that, Bill is well-traveled and participated in missions trips to South Africa, Haiti, Cuba, and other African and Caribbean countries. Ladies and gentlemen, as we jump into our discussion for today, I invite you to join in the conversation. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat. And as we near the end of the presentation, we will open up the floor and take from those questions and have Bill answer them live during the broadcast. So get into it with us and join me as we welcome none other than the esteemed Bill Davis.
Thank you, Brother Safir. I was listening to the intro, bro. I'm like, I appreciate it. I appreciate it, man. I appreciate the opportunity to share this information with the frontiersmen and anyone else who happens to be listening. And it's time. It's a timely conversation. It's a very timely conversation. And so in light of the tragedy just happened in Buffalo last week, then issues that impact the Black family, and part of in fact, a significant part of the presentation focuses on resources that we can have access to or should access that will help us. And so I'm going to deviate a little bit from how I intended to start the presentation and do a very short libation. I just feel that in light of the tragic circumstances in Buffalo, it would not be appropriate for us to have this conversation without doing some form of libation. And so for people who know me and my work, whenever I do libation, I always start with our ancient ancestors in Egypt, what was then called Kemet. And so I always call Brother Imhotep, Queen Nefertari, Queen Hatshepsut. I mean, we go back 5,000 years. And so for our ancient ancestors who provided us with light, wisdom, medical information, science, math, in their names, can we say Ashe?
Ashe.
And then for our millions of African sisters and brothers who were captured in the interior of Africa, shackled around the throat, wrists, waist, ankles, and marched hundreds of miles into the slave dungeons, stayed in those dungeons for weeks to months at a time. Some people sadly call them slave castles, the real slave dungeons. No light. They would stay there, fight for food there and wait until the slave ships came. And then we went through the door of no return on these slave ships for another several weeks to months at a time, fought for food there. Women menstruated there. Children were born there. People committed suicide there. A lot of tragic things happened over the course of several hundred years when our ancestors endured this tragic circumstance. In their names, can we say Ashe? And so I'm thinking about Sister Harriet, Brother Frederick, Nat Turner, Denmark, VC. There were millions of us that fought, ran away, broke tools, tried to poison the slave masters, burned stuff down. We did a lot of things, even though people don't necessarily recognize how our efforts to fight back. Unfortunately, it took us hundreds of years to end slavery. But in their names, can we say Ashe? We're a little over 100 years since the Tulsa Massacre. But even preceding the Tulsa Massacre was what was called the Red Summer of 1919, when there were thousands of us lynched and burned at the stake. And even brothers who fought in World War I came back in their uniforms and were still lynched and burned at the stake. And so I want us to think about the fact that Buffalo is just the most recent tragedy. We can go back a few years to Charleston. We can go back before that to other incidents in which we have been tragically hunted, shot, killed. And so the names of all of those ancestors, can we say Ashe, Ashe, Ashe? And so when we think about the health and wellness of the Black family, circumstances like Buffalo, the trauma of Buffalo, because it not just impacts those families there, it impacts all of us. And so I could have called George Floyd's name. I could have called Breonna's name. I could have called Trayvon Martin's name. I mean, there's just so many names to call. And so that our collective trauma intensifies whenever these circumstances happen. And so it's important for us to think about healing and what do we do? What steps do we take? How do we, find a way to put ourselves back together after the tragic circumstances that we've had to live through? And so today I'm hoping that, as we're dealing with this information, we will certainly think about what we do individually and what can we do collectively. And so if we could go to the second slide, my brother. When I put this presentation together, I was thinking about the mind, body, and spirit, and how all three are connected in order for us to be well. And so that, I'm going to talk a little about the history, which I mentioned briefly in the libation. And I want to think about our physical health and our diet. And how do we, are we eating well? Are we exercising? I've heard people talk about pandemic pounds and what does that mean? And what are we doing to try to make sure that we're keeping ourselves in a healthy form? And, as I mentioned earlier, we have to think about our mental health and the fact that, we are constantly under attack, whether in some very vicious form, as we just saw in Buffalo, whether it's in altercations with the police, whether it's in unfortunate circumstances. There's been a spike in violence since the pandemic. And so we're in a moment in history that is particularly challenging. And then for me, the most significant part of the presentation deals with resources, because I think there's one thing to understand that we can identify issues. It's another thing to take the step to actually do something to change it. And so I'm hoping that people will access the information in some constructive way that will lead to hopefully an improvement, because we need our families healthy physically, mentally, and spiritually. So, brothers, so people go to the next slide. So as I mentioned earlier, our history dates back at least 5,000 years. So we think about the Black family, we have to go back to our ancient days in Egypt or Kemet. And so our King Ramses was a pharaoh for 70 years. The brother, if you ever get to Egypt to see the monuments in his name, it's absolutely incredible. Queen Nefertari, I mean, she was one of the most incredible queens in our history. King Mansa Musa was thought to be the richest man in the world because when he was traveling to Mecca, he would stop. He gave out so much gold that the price of gold was depressed for a decade or two after that. And then the Queen Nzinga fought the Portuguese for many years before they could go into Angola and take our ancestors out and put us into slavery. And so when we think about our journey back through history, we've been fighting white supremacy really since the 1400s when slavery really started. We talk about 1619 in the United States, but it started in the 1400s, other places in the world. But I want us to really just reflect on the fact that, we've endured a lot. We've been able to survive it, but we have some things to do to be able to excel. We go to the next slide. So then the next slide talks about when we were in captivity. All right. Well, I guess we skipped over that slide, but it's okay. But I want us to come to understand that even the CDC, there's been several organizations or several people that have been critical of the CDC because they gave out mixed information about the pandemic. One of the things that they really got right was they talked about racism and health. And if we can go, I don't think we can open the link, Sophia, but we can open the link. The CDC talks about how racism is such a profound impact on our health, and that we have to figure out a way to make sure that we are cognizant of the structural aspects of racism. And so when people ask, and make it seem as though it's an individual thing, it's a structural thing. So when we think about what it is that impacts us, we go largely to people other than African Americans for employment. Many of us go to PDI or predominantly white institutions. Many of us are in circumstances in which we have to use, quote unquote, our white voice when we're calling for a house, a job, or about a car, those kind of things. And so the pressure of having to be in those kind of environments certainly has an impact on us. And so what are the social determinants of health? The social determinants of health are the things that pertain to where we live, where we work. And so if you think about what's taking place during the pandemic, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a spike in violence. So we know that people have been on lockdown, have pressure. I mean, I would not be shocked if everyone who's watching or listening to this, either directly or indirectly, has been impacted by COVID. And so how did people handle being in lockdown for weeks to months to years, and then having to wear a mask, and then the anxiety of going someplace and then wondering if you're going to contract COVID, and then whether you had to work from home and you're in isolation. I mean, so there's very different elements that deal with the social determinants of health. But when we understand what those issues are, we can be proactive about what we should do about them. And so it's one thing to have a level of awareness. The next step is to figure out what is actually going to be a proactive step, or even could be a reactive step if necessary, to try to change it. And so the next slide, Brother Sophia, lists the 10 most significant things that cause us to pass. So when we look at it, unfortunately, diabetes is up there, high asthma is up there, respiratory illnesses are up there. Murder is up there. I mean, there are some things on this list which with diet and exercise we could change. And so, stroke is one of the things that impacts us, which is a function or related to stress. So it's to think about the issues that impact our health and whether or not we are taking steps to change that. And in fact, most of the things that are listed, the only thing that's on here for men that's not on there for women is homicide. So we can go to the slide for sisters. So when we go to the health circumstances for Black women, they're pretty much the same, except for the fact that homicide is not one of the things that's listed. And so homicide for Black men occurs, death by police is very high, and then death by other Black people is very high. But for women, it's the same thing. We have to look at diabetes, stroke, cancer. I mean, I want us to think about what we're doing and what we have to do in terms of changing. And so if we're living in, to make the correlation back to the social determinants of health, if we're living in communities that have incinerators, if we're living in communities that have various kinds of things that impact our respiratory, right? I mean, that contributes to asthma, that contributes to other kinds of issues that we have, the lower respiratory illnesses. I mean, there are a lot of different illnesses that we can think about that if we can environmentally improve our situation, we would be in a better situation. And so I'm hoping that as we think about our activism, how do we, and so when Brother Safir was doing the introduction, he talked about the scholarship that, the Frontiersmen offered, which is absolutely a phenomenal thing for the community. And we're at a moment in history in which we have places in the United States that are banning books. I mean, how do we get to a place in which we're now banning books, information that is pertinent to people understanding? I mean, so the very atrocious act that just happened in Buffalo, if we think about it, we had a young white man who is of the misbelief that white people created all the amazing things in the world. And so as a consequence that, this is a white country, which it never was. And so, but in reality, it makes it seem as though that, even though our ancestors built many of the wealth of the country, most of the wealth of the country, many of the buildings of the country, we're in a circumstance in which we are now being viewed as a liability to the country, which is an absolute horrific misunderstanding of history. But the point I'm making, though, is that, fortunately, the Frontiersmen do provide scholarships, but where the paradox is we have books being banned, and then people talking about critical race theory as if it's never been taught in public school. It's only been taught at graduate and law school, but they use it as a rallying cry to confuse people. And so we need to be conscious of it as it pertains to how we inform and educate ourselves. So, Brother Sophia, if we could go to the next slide. Right, the one after this one. So when our ancestors were brought here, there were 4 types of food that Europeans brought to make our transition here easier, commonly called soul food. And so Africa and throughout the Caribbean, rice is one of the main staples of the food. And so rice has, a lot of different benefits. It's cooked a lot of different ways. Okra, which is a very healthy food, is one that has, gumbo, a lot of different meals. In fact, the people who are from India, cook a lot of okra in theirs. And so pork, ironically, even though, it's not necessarily the healthiest food, but we eat it, and we eat from the rooter to the tutor, as my father used to say, so we eat the pig feet, we eat the ears, we eat, the guts, as Malcolm X used to call them. As we just celebrated Malcolm X's birthday the other day, Malcolm X used to call us a gut eater when we're eating chitlins. And then lastly, greens. And if you haven't had any Ethiopian greens, woo, oh my goodness. But collard greens has been a staple in our community for many, many years. And if you have never seen the movie Soul Food Junkie, it is a great movie. Byron Hurt, the same brother that did Beyond Beats and Rhymes, which is a documentary about hip hop, did a documentary about Soul Food Junkie, and shows, the transition of how these foods migrated from Africa to Central, South, and North America, all throughout the Caribbean, and how we've incorporated it into our diet in many ways. And so the question is, are we incorporating it in a healthy way or an unhealthy way? If we go to the next slide. Holistic practices. And so people have heard the expression, that it's mind, body, and spirit, which certainly those are the 3 aspects of who we are as human beings. And so our holistic health considers the multidimensional aspects of who we are. It encourages us to recognize our physical, mental, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual selves. And so when we're thinking about what do we do to stay well, then we need to think about it globally or holistically. Next one. Yes, sir, brother. We can go to the next slide. This one is particularly poignant right now because sadly for us, our anxiety and depression levels were high before, but they increased during COVID. And so prior to COVID, about 1 in 10 African Americans would be clinically diagnosed as either suffering from anxiety or depression. Since the pandemic, we're now 4 in 10. And so the question is, what are we going to do to address it? I mean, so there's a stigma about mental health or going to get mental health services. So we really need to think about how do we address the stigma. So for instance, are we going to do anything for the trauma that we just experienced in Buffalo? When slavery ended, we never got any kind of mental health services for all the trauma that we endured for the 250 years that our ancestors were enslaved here. And then we got 100 years of Jim Crow that followed that. I mean, so we've been trying to keep ourselves healthy and well despite the hostile environment that we've been in. But I think that we hopefully have reached a point in our journey throughout the world that we recognize the value in our own mental health. Because if we're talking about the health of the Black family, if we have people in our family who are really suffering, it's hard to say that the family is doing well when in fact we have so many individuals within our family that are not. And so it's important for us to embrace whatever services that we're eligible for, whatever service we can receive. The sooner that we can do that, and whether we do it as an individual, whether we do that as a family, whether we do that as couples, I am a strong advocate for making sure that we get the mental health services and care that we desire. We go to the next one, please. It's a similar kind of circumstance. The main thing that I want to emphasize in this slide, though, is the fact that racism and structural racism, not just individual racism, but structural racism, are critical factors in our well-being. And until we actually speak it out, like some of us endure it silently, and then we take out the rage on people who we care about. And so, but it's important for us to be able to articulate our rage in a healthy and constructive form, whether we verbalize it, whether we write it, whether we meditate, whatever we do, but we have to make sure that we are processing our rage and the disappointment about issues that we're facing, because if we don't, then it becomes internal and it leads to us having these unhealthy behaviors, whether we're drinking too much, smoking too much, shopping too much. I mean, there's a lot of different things that people do to try to medicate. That self-medication is something that ultimately leads to unhealthy behaviors. And so it's important for us to make sure that we can channel as much as possible where the source of our rage comes from, and then how do we do things to try to correct it. We go to the next one. So this slide shows that we are woefully underrepresented. Only 2% of psychiatrists and 4% of psychologists are African American. And so while we're almost 14% of the population, we are underrepresented in mental health practitioners. And so, and then in addition to being underrepresented there, we also have to think about whether the practitioners, even people from our community, whether they're culturally competent and whether they're providing us information in some healthy form that's going to allow us to be able to receive the services that are being offered to us. Because if they're not, then the likelihood of us having a successful experience while we're receiving the care is reduced. And so if we have anyone that's aspiring, particularly any young people that are aspiring for a career that, you know, talk about they want to do something that's going to be advantageous to the community, whether become a psychologist, a social worker, a nurse, something that's going to be advantageous in terms of us being able to work through the issues and challenges that we're facing emotionally, that would be a profound and significant contribution. Next slide. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of resources that I put together because I think it's one thing to identify issues. I think it's another thing to talk about what the resources are to be able to address them. So, the New Jersey Association of Black Psychologists, their website is absolutely very conscious. The images, the information is really helpful. Same thing for the New Jersey Association of Black Social Workers. And so there's 2 Black Nurses Associations in New Jersey. And so I want you to recognize the fact that sometimes when we are saying that we can't find anything or that we need help, there are resources available to us. It's just a question of us being able to actually identify them and then to access them. So when Sophia did my introduction, he mentioned I'm a single dad. And so one of the first lessons that I learned as a single dad was to ask for help, because all of us at some point are going to need help. And whether we can put our ego in our pocket and ask for it. And even if we don't receive it initially, but we have to just keep reaching out. And sooner or later, the concept of providence, which is that as you reach out for things, the universe will bring to us what it is that we need in order to be able to move forward. We go to the next slide. Dr. Amos Wilson was one of our most profound teachers. The Developmental Psychology of the Black Child, for those of you that are parents or a grandparent, that is a phenomenal book. Dr. Naim Akbar, Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery, and it's, a must read. So if you've never read that one, please make sure you do. Dr. Joy DeGruy, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, is really, really on point about how some of the behaviors from slavery have been carried over and what we need to do to address it. If you go on YouTube, any one of these people that I'm mentioning have videos on YouTube that you can certainly go and find. And Dr. Frances Cress Wells, when she wrote the ISIS papers, which talks about the confrontation between us and Europeans, that book was written, many of these books, except for Dr. Joy DeGruy's book, were written at least 30 more years ago. But it's still pertinent today. And so that's why I'm saying that, sometimes we need to make sure that we're going back and revisiting some of the information that our ancestors, Dr. Joy is still living, as Naim Akbar is. But their information is pertinent for the current moment, the current situation that we're in. We go to the next one, please. Some additional resources. Oasis, it has stories and recipes. And so sometimes, we're thinking about how to change our diet, how to live a more healthy lifestyle, all those kind of things. And so this particular resource, the Old Ways Africana Soup and Stories, it's a celebration. So we have to embrace the work that other people have done that would be advantageous for us to access now. And so when I was doing the research, I was like, there was that old expression of recreating the wheel. We don't have to recreate the wheel. There are resources available to us that if we just utilize them, we could see a significant improvement in our life. But Sophia, we go to the next one, please. And so you may know this sister. She is incredibly popular, has been on all type of food shows. And so I'm hoping that if you've never watched or read anything by Carla Hall, she is an absolute gem as far as providing information. And, it's about soul food and about how we can eat soul food in a healthy way. And, she has a book for you to check out. She's, been on all different kind of talk shows. And so if you, go to YouTube, look for her, you can also find interviews with her, recommendations about, recipes and food choices that are going to help to keep us well. And so I mentioned earlier about the pandemic pounds. And so because of the fact that we were on lockdown for such a long period of time, food becomes, what's the word I want? Comfort food. And so as a way to appease ourselves, we were doing a lot of sitting and a lot of eating. And so as a consequence, we, increased the weight. But now it's time to get more healthy food and to do more exercise so that then we can get the more weight we carry than we should, it puts more stress on our heart, our lungs, our knees, different joints throughout our body. And so, which is one of the reasons that I'm advocating that we really consider what our healthy practices are. Brother Sophia, we go to the next one. Black health facts matter. And so this slide, this website has a lot of different information on it. And so as we're contemplating, because I know one of the things, and we justifiably, so for instance, there was a lot of tension in our community when the vaccines came out. And people were very skeptical about the information and whether or not what was given, what the information was directed to us. And, because of Tuskegee, among other circumstances and in the health field, we've been, somewhat leery of accepting and believing that the things that people are telling us are correct. And so, but this website is information by us and for us. So I'm hoping that we will definitely check that website out. And so these are the references continued. And so I really believe, that we need to get information, and the better information we get, the better decisions that we make. And when we see that we are disproportionately high in diabetes and stroke, heart disease, all of those things, while we may sometimes not necessarily want to accept that that's true, but when we see it by Black health professionals who are documenting the circumstances that we face, which is why, to me, acquiring this information becomes so important. I'm hoping that you will utilize the information that's here and then find some way to improve your family as well as your personal health. Next slide, my brother. Eat plants and prosper. Great website, more recipes, more information about how to improve your health. And so, in the interest of full disclosure, transparency, I've been a vegetarian for decades. And so, I'm not advocating something that I don't practice. So I've, had some Ethiopian food yesterday, some collard greens and some lentils. And so, but I just want to encourage people to really think about, when Dick Gregory came out 50 years ago talking about how we can improve our health. For people who are part of the Nation of Islam, Elijah, how to eat to live, Elijah Muhammad, how to eat to live. I mean, so these ideas about improving our health have been around for a long time. It's time for us really to take the information and to act on it. Brother, we go to the next one. Yes. And in case you don't know, Black men die sooner than anybody else in the country. And so the Black Men's Health Project, it talks about what we need to do physically and emotionally to extend the life of Black men. And so I'm hoping, particularly for brothers, if you don't go to any other website, make sure you go to this one, because we have to be much more pragmatic about what we eat, how we exercise, what we do to reduce stress, because the stress manifests in ways that is very unhealthy for all of us, sometimes for our families, sometimes for our spouses or significant others, sometimes people in the community. We have that displaced rage that manifests in us doing unhealthy things. So if brothers don't check out any other website, please check out the Black Men's Health Project. And so I also included, because sometimes we forget how committed we have been. And so there are several medical practitioners that I included in here. You may be familiar with Charles Drew, because Charles Drew developed the first blood plasma. And so, Dr. Leonise Barry, was a pioneer in gastroenterology. And so, we've been for decades been practicing in the medical field, even in ways that we sometimes either don't know or forgot. And so when I'm hearing some of this conversation now about situations where people make it seem as though, that we don't have any history, we have a long history. Brother, we go to the next one. So some of the other people who are listed on here, right? So one of the people who I really did make sure I wanted to identify is Dr. Barbara Ross Lee, the sister of Diana Ross, who was director of osteopathic medicine. I mean, so we have a long history of being involved in the health professions. And so I hope that you have a health practitioner that you're connected to who can give you honest and accurate information that will guide you physically and emotionally about how to make sure that you are in the best health that you can be and what steps you might want to take that's going to help you to do better. But ultimately, it's really up to us to not just hear the information, but to act on it. We go to the next one, brother. Yeah, I know we can make it just a little bit larger. There's a couple of more trailblazers that I listed here. Dr. Jane Wright was born in 1919. I mean, so think about that. Her father was a doctor. She became very active in the medical field and made some significant accomplishments. And so, I'm hoping that just reading this, I mean, Daniel Hale Williams, did, heart surgery. I mean, so we go back decades in the medical profession. And so, but because of discrimination, right? So Charles, Drew, Daniel Hale Williams, even though they made these significant contributions, were still subject to racism. Some of the things that they invented or, did first, they might have become the victim of it because of the fact of racism in the country. But we have a long, distinguished history of being involved in the medical community. Next slide, my brother. These are just some images of some of the people who are listed. And so I hope that you will, one of my mentors, made sure that I understood that it's one thing to have information, nothing to act on it. And so when Frontiers asked me to put this presentation together, I really thought about how can I provide information that will hopefully be actionable, that we can retrieve it, identify what the need is, and be honest enough to accept that we need some change, and then reach out for the resources that are going to help us to move forward. Next one, my brother. We've come to Q&A. When I was working on this presentation, I was thinking about the spirit of Ubuntu. And the spirit of Ubuntu is that I am, and all of us are, because we are here collectively. And however we can support and embrace and do things to support ourselves collectively, we have never been able to make serious advancement unless we've worked together collectively. And the better we can work together collectively, the easier it will be for us to go forward, or for our community to go forward. And so I'm hoping if you have any questions, comments, please share them. I will happily answer as best I can. I'm not a medically trained professional, but I've tried to identify some medically trained, where you can get information from medically trained professionals who have the interests of our community at heart. So, Pierre, thank you, brother. You did a great job going through the slides, and hopefully, there'll be some information that people will decide that's of benefit to them.
Yeah, so for all of those who are joining us live today, we will share the links that were provided on our social media sites, both on Facebook and on YouTube, so that you can use them and leverage them for your own use to make certain that you're gaining access to resources, care, practitioners even that you might not otherwise have had access to. Now, Brother Davis, you talked a little bit about how, as a people in this country, Black people were disproportionately impacted at higher rates than others when the pandemic hit, with the decline of our mental health. What do you think are some of the causal factors for those disparities and how we can overcome them? Of course, you touched on some of the overcoming of it, but I want to emphasize for our listeners and those who are participating online what some of those causal factors were.
Absolutely. And so, my brother, my battery's running low, so hold on 1 second so I can just get the cord I need so we don't run out.
Oh, yes, we can't have that. So, ladies and gentlemen, again, you are joining us for the Black Family Health and Wellness, a status report. as was demonstrated already, we have much to overcome. And while we have made much progress over the course of our time here in America, there are still challenges that plague us. Our communities are oftentimes still disproportionately targeted by improper, unlawful, and violent policing. And of course, I'll be the first to say that that does not represent all police. However, the fact is, we are being impacted most adversely and most frequently as a people by bad policing. And so it's going to be important that we begin to tear away at some of the obstacles that keep us from living and maintaining lives of good health and wellness, both physically and mentally. So, Brother Davis, the question again was, what were some of those causal factors, in your opinion, that led to such a disparity in how we were adversely impacted in the decline of our mental health from COVID-19?
Absolutely. I mean, so one is, I would say the major one is poverty. And so our community is disproportionately poor. And so as a consequence, our access to healthcare, both for mental health and physical health, is very limited. And in addition to that, the stress of being the essential workers. And so from being more exposed to or being in environments in which the virus can be transmitted. And then the reality of whether or not our children, so since we went to virtual learning, our children were not receiving what they should receive academically. And so when you look at the fact that we're disproportionately poor, the fact that we are essential workers, so we have the stress of trying to go to and from work in environments in which we may contract the virus, and then for the fact that our children are not receiving what they should receive, all of those circumstances would contribute to an increase in stress. We don't have very many productive outlets to release the stress if we're not connected to, and I don't know if people have, health groups in which they come together and support each other, so there are, when sadly, whenever someone passes, then there might be people that come together and offer support for a period of time for that person to be able to overcome the event that has just transpired. But if we think about it, we should have support groups on an ongoing basis that are dealing with the issues that we face in our community. And so the better that we can figure out ways to be engaged with each other, to offer each other support, strategies, and resources that would help us to identify and recognize some of the circumstances that we're confronted with, it would help our community immensely.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting because lack of and level of access remains a significant concern and issue within our communities. But what I also find is that in concert with that, there's also this lasting and longstanding level of distrust for many people in the medical industry, if you will. And for good reason, if you would think about it. I mean, when you think about what has transpired over the course of our history, whereby we were subjected to tests unknowingly, given syphilis without being told, without consenting, lied to by an industry that is tasked with protecting and healing. And therefore, there remains this remnant of distrust. And oftentimes, even though the distrust exists, what I find is that medical professionals who are not necessarily as concerned or can relate to the conditions that we face, oftentimes place the blame for the distrust on the patient. And I think that also creates another barrier that we need to overcome. What do you think are some effective ways to get beyond that? And perhaps how can doctors and healthcare facilities and that industry itself really start to tear away at the walls that separate us?
I mean, that's a very accurate description, my brother. Yes, there are reasons, historical reasons. It's historical trauma, right? I mean, so if we think about it, then yes, from Tuskegee through all the other, through the health clinics in which people went to those clinics to receive the appropriate care that they should receive. And, but in this slide that I showed that we only have 2% psychologists and 4% social workers, we are underrepresented in the fields that deal with us physically and emotionally. And so we are a significant increase in African Americans working in those fields who have the credibility and have the, so when this debate happened in our community around whether we should get the vaccine or not, and so the skepticism that you mentioned was one of the main things that contributed to us for, a significant number opting not to get the vaccine for fear that we were going to find out at some future point that this was done. And so there were several Black medical professionals who volunteered to be part of the trials, who had family members who died or were significantly impacted by this. And so one of the reasons I listed some of those Black healthcare professionals, professional organizations, is because at some point, if we don't know, we need to at least be able to have access to people that do. And so then, as opposed to listening to whatever other media outlet might be advancing the information, if we go get Black health professionals who are explaining to us the pros and cons, why we should be wary, what we should do, I just think that that's a significant step and I don't know how many of us actually did that. And so before I got the vaccine myself, I listened to numerous Black healthcare professionals who could explain the pros and cons of this. Because I was skeptical myself, like, wait a minute, I'm not really, because ultimately what happens is that, years later, oh, well, these are the side effects. This is what happens to you. But the anxiety, so that, coming back to the question you asked previously, the stress of whether or not we're going to get the virus.
Right.
Do we just shake hands? Do we just wave? Do we hug? How do we communicate? How do we interact with each other out of the anxiety of getting the virus? So I ultimately decided that I would rather take a chance proactively of getting the vaccine rather than have to have all the anxiety about whether or not I'm actually going to get it. And if the health information is accurate, if I did contract it, that at least I would have milder symptoms. And so I just think that, that long history. So for instance, Murphy has now introduced a bill in New Jersey that police have to have, it hasn't introduced the bill, he's introduced the idea of police having to get licensed, and the license has to be renewed every 3 years. And if they've committed infractions and stuff, that they should not be able to renew their license. And so he said it's a step towards helping to close the gap between the police and particularly the African-American Latin community. And so similar kind of things need to happen to close the gap between the African-American community mental and the health community. Because until that takes place, until we have more African-American practitioners that we trust, who we know are offering information that's in our interest, as opposed to the healthcare, whether it's the pharmaceutical industry or whatever entity it is, then I just think that that's going to be a major, what has to happen in order for us to be able to close the gap and to have more confidence.
Very good. Yeah, I think one of the ways too that we can bring those very goals about is partly through navigation services. I think just like you showed today in your presentation, access is an issue, awareness is an issue, and even the vehicles by which we gain access, those are issues as well. And when you think about the impact, and so as a social determinant of health, poverty remains a prevalent issue, because when someone is impoverished and they just have to continue to try and work their way out of it, even if it's a futile effort, the attempt will continue to be made almost endlessly. And so it's as if we're working to work. We're working to pay to get to work. We're working for the sake of making ends meet just to get to the next month, whereby we need to work just to reach that time frame. And so oftentimes we're consumed because of that fact. And as a result, health often takes a backseat.
Yes.
And so some of those social determinants are going to have to be addressed as well. And it is a collective effort. And I love that you presented it as such, because just like with navigation services, right? It really takes someone who is leading the charge to really be intentional about addressing these disparities and in an effective manner, instead of just checking a box, right? And so oversight, I think, is also a challenge there for such reasons. I'm not seeing any questions in the chat as yet. Ladies and gentlemen, I do thank you for joining us. I'm hoping that if you would like to join the conversation, that you can find your way to the chat, drop in any questions, comments, or even any types of regards or remarks you'd like to make in the chat, and we certainly will read them live during the broadcast. But as we come past that, I do want to touch on something briefly. You talked about in the spirit of Ubuntu, right? And this is about how I am because we are. I think society has done a good enough job of creating enough division by the presence of autonomy and independence, right? Where we now accept the idea that as long as I survive, I'm okay. And we've begun to abandon the thinking that together we rise and divided we fall. And so how do you think we can, even as Black men, as fathers, as community leaders, how we can get back to some of those concepts of collective economics and all of those things that really helped us as a people to be resilient and to thrive and survive all the atrocities we faced?
One of my mentors had a great saying, brother. He said that when all else fails, let me see if I can get it right, that ultimately the circumstances, so tragically, Buffalo, South Carolina, all these different things that happen are sobering reminders, tragic, sobering reminders that we have to work together. And so, we keep thinking, so we've been struggling with this for generations, right? Yeah. Because the United States is building the idea of individual advancement rather than collective advancement. We've only made progress when we work together collectively. And so, we just celebrated Malcolm X's birthday the other day. Every year we, celebrate Dr. King's birthday. And so, but as great as Malcolm and King were, if it was not for the thousands of people that supported them, we wouldn't know who they are. And so their work is embodied in the people who supported and, participated in the things they were trying to get us to do. And so we're faced with that situation now. And so the only way that we're going to ever really be able to advance is when we come together collectively. And one of our great ancestors, Amir Baraka, said that we need unity without uniformity. And so Malcolm X would talk about, when he said, he was a Black nationalist, that you can be a Christian, you can be a Muslim, you can be agnostic, you can be whatever you choose to be and still operate within the framework of Black nationalism. Yeah. And so we've been trying to integrate, we've tried to separate, we've tried a lot of different things, but ultimately it's our collective upliftment that has allowed us to survive. And the sooner that we can learn how to embrace each other more, and with the social media outlets that are available to us now and the resources that are available to us now, I think that, this moment and our children, hopefully, who will have, greater dexterity with this information than we do, will be able to figure out a way to use these platforms for our collective steps forward. Ultimately, that's what has to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. A couple of times during the broadcast, Buffalo was mentioned. And it's a tragic situation. It's a tragic sort of events that transpired that day by this young man who set out to do exactly what he had done and more, of course.
Right.
And as I think about it, in many ways, as a collective people, all of America, right? There's some responsibility that remains with the normalization of such behaviors and the acceptance and even the celebration of individuals who have perpetrated such atrocities and violence against Black people, like Kyle Rittenhouse, for example, right? Not only did he get off, but he's now invited to talk shows and is celebrated for his heroic acts of killing people who were unarmed. I can't even begin to think how we would begin to peel away at the issues that allow that type of situation to exist. And I don't know if you can help me with that, but I get perplexed because it's such a complex issue. And of course, you know, the media survives because of polarization, right? That's how ratings soar. But we've become so polarized as a society, as a country, over so many issues. But race is always coming back to the center of it. And I just don't know if you have any advice on how we begin to approach.
But around, Brother Sophia, I mean, you know, as tragic as Buffalo, Tulsa, Charleston, it always comes down to the fact of denial of our humanity. That has been true from the time. I want you to think about how, you know, our fight with white supremacy or against white supremacy. So from the time that our ancestors were put into slavery, right? And our women were raped and, you know, families were separated and sold away. I mean, so our humanity has been denied for hundreds of years. And so what this guy did, and in the Rittenhouse case, you know, let me grab another one. It was all about money. So they denied our humanity, said that we were savages, we didn't have any history and all that kind of stuff, just so they could, you know, appease their own, the cognitive dissonance, right? They knew they were not doing something right, but in order for them to justify it, then they shifted their anxieties and fears onto us to say, you know, these people aren't worthy of. So our denial of our humanity has been the central issue for hundreds of years. And so for the people who are part of this white supremacist movement that's still present, right? I mean, so in addition to what they did to us, they did it to the indigenous people, which are been called Native Americans. And, you know, Columbus got lost, so it was going to Indians, which is why we call them Indians instead of indigenous people, because they didn't call themselves Indians. They called themselves Dakota and all other kind of names. And so we need to be conscious of the fact that they did the same thing, the Trail of Tears. So when we think about the Trail of Tears that our indigenous people talk about, we had our own Trail of Tears when we were captured and marched to the slave dungeons. We were put on the slave ships, when we were whipped to death on the plantations. We had our own Trail of Tears. And so this country has built on stolen land and stolen labor. And so the original sins have never been atoned for. And so, you know, we keep hoping that in some way that the creation myth that the country was founded on would one day become true, that you do have the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that premise has never embraced all of who we are. And so, you know, and so rich whites have been able to convince poor whites that their interest is more aligned with them than it is. So all poor people are being exploited by rich people, right? Regardless of what ethnic group they may be attached to. But these divide and conquer continues to work. I mean, the shift in income from middle class and poor people to rich people during the pandemic has been one of the most horrific things that's not really talked about. And so, you know, there's a geometric increase in their financial well-being at the expense of the rest of us. So what's happening now with these oil companies ripping us off at the gas? There's no shortage of gas.
Right.
There's absolutely no shortage of gas, but we are paying crazy prices and the oil companies still get subsidies from the government. And so when you think about it, all of us are being ripped off. But as long as the divide and conquer situation works, then, you know, we turn against each other rather than turn to each other and say, listen, let's not continue to support the capitalist model that has exploited all of us for such a long time. And so that to me is the challenge that we've faced for hundreds of years. And sadly, because of the way that, you know, the media operates, we have been consistently put in this position in which we have to choose a fool like Trump, right? You know, I mean, so we had a narcissistic, incompetent asshole in the White House. And it got the second largest number of votes in the history of the country. right?
Wow.
Despite
Wow.
all of the horrific stuff that he did, right? Joe Biden got the most votes in the history of the country. Trump got the second most votes in the history of the country, despite being a narcissistic, incompetent fool. And so it just goes to show you, P.T. Barnum said it best. There's a sucker born every day.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's also very telling because it means that while we have come to believe that much progress has been made by the acceptance of us for others in this country, the fact is that secretly they were concealing the fact that they shared the views of this man and therefore were willing to jump behind him and support him.
Yeah.
It's always a rich discussion with you. I wish we could do this every week. Yeah, I'm putting that out there because we do have some other things coming up. So I will be looking for you. It won't be every week, but looking to see where we could partner to further the work of that agenda. And so as we prepare to close, I do want to give you the opportunity to share any closing remarks with our viewers today. And so I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to jump backstage, let you connect with folks, go right into the camera, let them know who you are, and bid them adieu. And then I'll come back and then we'll close out the broadcast.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Yes, sir, brother. Brother Saphir, and to the frontiersmen of Plainfield, I absolutely appreciate the opportunity to share some information today. I really do hope that people will access the resources. I wanted to concentrate on making it a resource-rich presentation that would hopefully help people to see where we are, where they are individually, where our community is collectively, and in that spirit to be able to, honor the legacy of the ancestors that, have allowed us to be in this moment in history. And that the better that we embrace information, the better that we act on it, the better that we acknowledge where our needs are and what we can do to, be able to fulfill those needs, then the easiest going to be for us, individually, collectively, as a community, to go forward. And so I would like to say, particularly now that we're about to enter the summer months, and in the spirit of trying to keep peace in our community, that we figure out ways to engage some young people and to provide them with some healthy, life affirming options that would hopefully not allow the violence in our community to spike any more than it already has. And so whether we're mentoring, whether we're providing access to different type of resources for young people in particular, but I'm hoping that we will think about how we can improve our individual and collective health, and that we will come together periodically and have conversations. We can have a community forum series about what we're doing, steps that we need to take to go forward. And so please stay healthy, stay well, drink a lot of water, take a walk, meditate, do something that's going to help your spirit to be able to get through the challenges and moments that we're in right now.
Bill, I thank you so much for joining us and sharing on today. Certainly, this has made for a rich discussion. Definitely some resources and important information that folks can use immediately so that they can begin to overcome the challenges that they are facing. Everyone, I want to encourage you, for all of our viewers on today, if you are afforded an opportunity to support or even to correct one of your own, someone who is in your community, someone who you might bypass every day, I encourage you to be vigilant. I encourage you to be bold. I encourage you to be caring, because every one of us in our communities, though we live individually and do things individually to make a living for ourselves, collectively, we are better together. Moreover, whether you realize or want it to be the case or not, the very person that you bypass each day will still represent you in the eyes of the rest of America. And therefore, we each have a collective responsibility to build up one another so that we can continue to overcome all that has been thrown at us and all the obstacles that remain. because together we rise and divided we fall. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us here on today, where our discussion was the Black Family Health and Wellness, a status report. Again, we will share with you the links on our Facebook and YouTube pages so that you can access them for your use at home, gaining access to the limited number of psychologists and psychiatrists that are available, who are also considered Black. That will be available along with all the other resources about how you can employ them at home to make a better lifestyle for yourself and for your family. Thank you again for joining us. We are the Frontiers International Plainfield Area Club. We stand for advancement through service. I am Safir Jenkins, the sitting president, and I am so grateful for your time on today. And I wish you a wonderful weekend. Stay safe. It is going to be a scorcher. We have heat advisories all throughout the Jersey and New York area. So please be careful and check on those who might be elderly in your community or within your family, and all of your loved ones, and anyone who may have an underlying condition by which heat could be detrimental to their health. I bid you adieu, and I wish you much happiness, peace, love, joy, and success and prosperity. Goodbye.